Hey, Retcon Raider here, and welcome back to one of our increasingly infrequent Retcon Retrospectives. Technically I've got this one labeled as covering Q4 of 2022, but I suppose at this point we're basically covering January as well. Also, Kaiser's here. He's currently lying on my hand, so I really hope I get all of this on the first take. That said, not really a lot to say on the numbers, he said at the beginning of a 10-minute segment specifically about the numbers. They were actually a little stagnant in Q4, at least in October and November. We were making gains, but lower than average, which I'd probably attribute to those months mainly being dedicated towards one or two already long-running series. For better or worse, that's the trade-off you make when you dedicate so much time and effort towards a single ongoing project on YouTube. The Rat series has a lot of fans, but at the same time, the audience growth tends to dwindle as episode counts get higher. That said, I will note that the Rat series is still operating within what I'd consider acceptable parameters. I generally only worry about a series when it starts dipping below a certain threshold, currently about 1,000 views per episode. In those cases, I'll usually only stick with it if it's a game that I'm really passionate about, or if we're right up towards the ending anyway. So, it can come to a better, natural conclusion than just pulling the plug. Scarlet Hollow and Wildermyth are both good examples of that. I'd love it if they were more popular with my general audience, but at the same time, those are both games that I'm willing to sacrifice some potential ad rev just so I can keep playing them. Of course, it also helps that there's a very dedicated segment of the Raiders and the rank-and-file viewers who essentially help fund those particular projects, both through Patreon and through direct donations. So I mean, it's not like it's a complete cost sink. Certainly not as profitable as some of my other series though, but like I said, it's all a trade-off. As always, it's the eternal struggle of trying to find some balance between the things I want to work on and the things that YouTube really tells me actually work, at least on their platform. Thankfully, with Wrath, we really haven't gotten to that point. There's been some dwindling on the numbers, a very gradual decline in viewer engagement over the past year or so, but by and large, it's held pretty steady. Kingmaker also saw very similar sustainability. That's honestly pretty remarkable given that we're just coming up on our 100th episode of Wrath as of the moment I'm recording this, and I think over our 250th episode of Pathfinder in general. As of the moment I'm recording this, if we count all the Pathfinder stuff together, it is the #1 longest running series on the entire channel, and even if we just count the Wrath stuff specifically, that would still be the second longest running series, just behind Battle Brothers, which clocked in at about 130-ish episodes. Something in that area. All things considered, that's not too shabby. Now, November saw us jumping into our first Wrath DLC, Through the Ashes. But honestly, that didn't really shake up the numbers all that much, even though it's essentially a standalone mini-campaign. I think the average viewer really just saw it as an extension of the main series. There was a modest spike when it first started up, but interest also dwindled a fair bit faster than it did on the main series. Again, as of the moment I'm writing this, we're just about to come up on the series finale, but in this case that's probably a good thing, because Ashes just wasn't as sustainable as the ongoing Wrath. Numbers were dropping off notably sharper from one episode to the next as we got towards the end, but overall, I think it was actually just short enough to not really overstay its welcome. It never quite hit that danger zone that I keep an eye out for. Now, December was where things really started ramping up. It's already one of the hotter months on YouTube because that's when, the algorithms start pushing more holiday ads, and thus channel people towards binge-worthy content, which I'm kind of on the periphery of. But in our particular case, it also coincided with the launch of the new Rogue Trader Alpha. Sadly, my numbers weren't exactly huge there, but it did lead to a very notable spike, maybe about 25% higher in all categories, compared to October and November. As often happens when I introduce a new series, it also triggered a small cascade of new views on older videos, as some of the new viewers started binging through my archives. It's actually one of my favorite parts about continuing to run the channel, is seeing people working their way through those older playlists, commenting on episodes that I recorded months or even years ago. That said, once we rolled into the new year, things started cooling again, though not quite as much as I would have expected. You know, I always brace myself for the Q1 slump. It's a pretty well-known phenomena at this point. There are no more lucrative holiday ads to push. Viewers have less time to binge as they head back to work or school. I've long since gotten used to seeing the analytics just take a nosedive this time of year, and January wasn't really an exception to that. However, I do think it's notable that despite the predictable dip, the numbers were still stronger in January than they were in October or November of last year. Not by a huge amount, but notable enough that it raised an eyebrow. We're talking 10, sometimes 15%. In part, I'd probably attribute that to the lingering hype surrounding the Rogue Trader Alpha series, though interest in that has also started waning a little these past few weeks. But I think I would also attribute at least some of the unexpected success towards my accelerated release schedule, 4 uploads a week. We've been maintaining that since, I think, early December, rather than the old 3.5. More uploads, obviously, directly results in better overall numbers, even if it's just an average of 2 extra videos a month. I'd actually like to aim for 5 uploads a week by the end of the year, but unfortunately that'll likely have to wait until I finish dealing with all the the pesky real-life stuff that's still gumming up the works and slowing everything down. I really don't want to get into that. We've already talked that to death. But aside from that, I suppose I should really also highlight some of the other tweaks that I've made over the past few weeks. This is drier stuff, but probably still worth touching on, especially for anyone who's interested in the whole, YouTube side of things. But as with every new year, I recently started trying to fine-tune my production process and how I approach certain aspects of the videos, in hopes of kind of juicing those numbers up a little. Like I said before, it's basically an ongoing effort to find some happy medium between what YouTube wants me to do and what I actually am willing to do. The most obvious tweak, and one I'm sure you've already noticed by now, is that I got rid of the extended video intros. I like doing them, but the recent trend on YouTube seems to be more and more creators just getting rid of their video intros entirely. I suppose the prevailing philosophy is starting to turn back towards the idea that you want to hook the viewer's attention as quickly as possible, and an extended intro kind of does the exact opposite of that. It's definitely another trade-off, mind you. The extended intro served a tactical purpose. It's why so many YouTubers tended to have them. Aside from giving each video a slightly more episodic and cinematic feel, and granted, padding out the runtime by an extra minute or two, it was also a deliberate buffer to try to avoid the oft-fickle YouTube auto-scanners. Up until late last year, YouTube would automatically scan the first 45 to 60 seconds of every new video uploaded, trying to automatically detect any content that it might deem to not be advertiser-friendly. If it flagged anything that it felt was not advertiser-friendly, correctly or not, that would result in the video being partially or fully demonetized until you could then wrangle a manual review, which had hoops you had to jump through, and it could take up to 48 hours. So, in the meantime, you'd be losing that first day or two worth of ad revenue, i.e., the single most profitable period of a new video's release window. The whole reason I started doing those extended intros in the first place was because of the mass demonetizations of 2018 and 2019. Back in the age of the eternal rolling adpocalypses, I don't miss those. But yeah, anyone who followed me back then may remember that it got to the point where, something like 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of all the videos I was uploading were automatically getting flagged, even though back then especially, I took huge pains to avoid anything objectionable. I didn't even swear, and I still try to avoid that when I can, but sometimes something slips out here and there. Or, sometimes I do it just because it's narratively appropriate. But the once upon a time, the vast majority of my uploads were getting hit with these false, objectionable content flags. And that's why I started doing those extended intros. You know, I fine-tuned them, trying to find exactly how long they needed to be, how innocuous and non-threatening they needed to be, and so on. And it worked out pretty great. And, you know, as an added bonus, it also gave me a chance to thank the raiders, the fine folks who helped make these videos possible. But that said, YouTube has gotten a little better since 2019, at least where the content scanner is concerned. There are other issues, but we won't get into that. And most recently, they changed it so that the content scanner now only scans the first 15 seconds of a video, which really reduces the need for an extended intro to circumvent it. Thus, my videos now have a dramatically shortened verbal intro. I'm trying to keep them to about 30 seconds on average, before we just dive into the rest of the gameplay stuff, you know, get things moving a little faster. I can't say it's gotten dramatic results thus far, but it does seem to have bumped up some of our numbers throughout January. Most notably, videos in January generally had about 10 to 20% more average view duration than they did in previous months. That would seem to imply that there are more new viewers, who are clicking onto the video and sticking around a little longer, as opposed to clicking on, seeing this 1 minute long extended intro and immediately clicking back off. That's good, and it could also account for the slight bumps in some of my other metrics as well. For example, it makes it a little easier to binge the videos on the playlists, because now you only have the one extended outro to get through between each episode, as opposed to back-to-back extended intros and outros. Kaiser, baby, you're drooling on my hand. Thank you. He licked it up. Okay, so, where were we? Oh, right. Okay, then of course, there's the other big change I've had to make these past few months, which is increasing the number of mid-run ad slots per video. You know, I spent the first few years of the channel trying to avoid mid-run ad slots in general. They just never really felt right, but the recent cascade of family crises finally necessitated getting over that particular hang-up. I mean, for better or worse, we are at the point where, unfortunately, with more looming expenses based around the recent crises, which I'm not going to get into, I do essentially have to find ways to make the channel more financially viable, more financially sustainable, if I want it to continue being what takes up the bulk of my time, as opposed to returning to the customer service sector or finding some other new gig to make a living with. That said, I'm still resistant to going full bore on ad placements. I talked to a number of other content creators before I started doing this, and shockingly, a lot of the content creators I talked to actually encouraged me to place an ad slot like every 2 minutes, which would break down to roughly 22 mid-run ads per episode. I don't really find that acceptable. So thus far, I've kept it to about a little under half that, I think. Average 8 per video. Current trend is, hold on, I've got a chart here. Okay, current trend is about 9 slots per 45-minute video, which has had a notable impact on the monthly earnings, and helped defray some of my other costs. My exact approach is still evolving from one month to the next as I experiment with new patterns and get feedback via my analytics. But my current pattern is to essentially front-load the video. They start more densely packed with ad slots, but become less and less frequent as you get deeper into the video. My understanding is that each of those slots only has a chance of triggering an ad, and then there's a mandatory cooldown of something like 8 or 10 minutes before another one can trigger. Front-loading makes it more likely that an ad will trigger early, before a viewer loses interest and clicks back off the video. But based on the numbers I've been seeing, watching a full episode, even with 8 or 9 ad slots, will only result in maybe about a third of those slots actually firing. I mean, you've got the pre-roll, which usually fires, and then after that, you've got a mix of like 2 or 3 banner ads, possibly with one of those slots, instead being an actual mid-run video ad. It's not guaranteed. You know, there's a percentile chance of what will trigger when, and so on and so on. As always, YouTube keeps the actual algorithms for that kind of thing shrouded in mystery. You know, got to keep us guessing so we can't blatantly exploit their formulas. But, you know, I feel like a couple of banner ads and maybe 1 or possibly 2 mid-run video ads is reasonable for your average 45 to 60 minute video. Then again, I'd certainly be curious to see what your thoughts on that sort of thing might be. That's pretty much exactly why I'm talking about it right now, both to disclose my process, my thoughts on the matter, and to fish for feedback. Hey, look at that, I got my hands back. Bye, Kaiser. So, aside from that, I suppose the other recent change I made that was probably noteworthy is that I've obviously tweaked my thumbnail formula. I've never really been much good with thumbnails. You know, the ones I craft are usually serviceable, to put it nicely. You know, sadly, I'm just not much of an artist, and the channel's not really profitable enough to justify the expense of hiring one to do the thumbnails for me. That said, I did recently take steps towards trying to make the thumbnails a little more eye-catching. Worked in a little neon, bumped the font on the episode numbers up again, this time all the way to 150, and started trying to get slightly better screenshots or art assets into the mix. Again, it hasn't exactly resulted in a dramatic shift in the numbers or anything, but there is a definite impact on the most recent episode analytics. Impulse clicks on new episodes are up from about 2% to 2.5%. That's certainly not nothing. Much as with the ad slot placements, I'll keep tweaking my approach moving forward. It's something that will likely change a little from one series to the next. I do actually really like the format I'm using with the last couple of Rogue Trader episodes, so I might try that with a few of the other projects in our queue. But, you know, not every game has the benefit of copious concept art or in-game photo modes. So I will have to play it by ear, especially when it comes to lower budget titles. Anyway, I think we're about analytics out at this point, so let's say we move on to something slightly more interesting. Let's talk about games. Again, much like with last time, I think we're going to skip the Retcon Radar segment this month. I'm still hoping to do some random one-shots and demos in the near future. I feel like that's a better way to showcase a lot of the indie titles that catch my eye, as, you know, opposed to briefly name-dropping them in a retrospective video like this one that the vast majority of my viewers are never going to watch. So instead, let's chat about my list of potential projects. The same list that I generally use to populate the monthly interest polls that you may occasionally see me blathering about. I keep some pretty extensive watch lists to help me keep tabs of upcoming new games, but I also have a lot of older games that I still think about going back to. With that in mind, I thought today we'd grab the Q1 interest poll and just sort of go down the list. Chat a little about the prospective projects so that you can get a better idea of exactly where my head is at on each title, and what I might actually like to do with each of them. We'll start with the big ones. Honestly, those are probably the ones that I have the least to say about. Wrath, for example. Wrath has maintained a death grip on the #1 slot on those polls for over a year now, and I honestly don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. It's always head and shoulders above every single other entry on the list. It's also a series that I enjoy working on, and it still gets solid numbers, so I'm happy to keep working on it. We're also past the halfway point at this point, so in theory, we are getting towards the end. Kind of. Maybe like 90 more episodes? Question mark? But man, think about how satisfying it's going to be when we finally do reach the end. It's been a ride. And, you know, I do look forward to eventually returning to Kingmaker. I just don't want to do that while we're still running Wrath. I think my only real point of hesitation when it comes to Wrath is some of the DLC stuff. Like I said earlier, I actually ended up enjoying Through the Ashes, but it definitely didn't have the staying power of the main series. I also think both Inevitable Excess and Treasures of the Midnight Isle are markedly weaker than Through the Ashes, so I'm not really sure how much time we'll end up spending on those. Of course, we've also got more Wrath DLC right around the corner. We've got The Last Sarkorians dropping in March, and the second part of Through the Ashes a little bit after that. I'll basically be approaching those on a case-by-case basis. Though I think it's pretty safe to say that we'll at least be covering The Last Sarkorians DLC, since it is going to be integrated right into the main campaign. I actually think the 6th DLC, the Canabris Celebration one, is also going to be added to the main campaign, but we don't really know a lot about that one just yet. But that one does sound intriguing. I'm hearing a lot of people compare it to the Mass Effect 3 Citadel DLC, which, I never played. I had uninstalled the game by the time that thing actually came out, but I've heard that's good, so, The Canabris DLC is something that piques my curiosity. Anyway, moving past Wrath, the second highest demand title right now, at least on the polls, is Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. And, honestly, I knew this one would do well given the hype. And it did start pretty strong back in December, with the predictable, slow drop-off in subsequent episodes. I think it's a very well-constructed game, especially for an early alpha, and I've very much enjoyed playing it thus far. The real question is going to be exactly when we pull the plug on the alpha series and start waiting for the beta or full launch. My original plan was to only do about 6 to 12 episodes until the numbers started flagging and they predictably hit that danger zone. But the numbers are still high enough to justify keeping it going. I'll be curious to see exactly where it ends up landing on the next poll or two, because that is likely to decide exactly when we stop. Not for good, of course. I have every intention to return to the game when it hits beta, at least for a little while. But I'll admit I'm also a little leery about overdoing it before we've hit the game's full launch. Then again, that didn't really end up hurting the numbers on games like Kingmaker or Wrath, both of which we covered pretty extensively during their respective betas. Both of the Pathfinder games ended up having a pretty consistent audience, both pre- and post-launch. So maybe that'll be the case with Rogue Trader. I guess we'll see. After that, we've got another game that's had some pretty consistent demand as of late. Baldur's Gate 3, which landed in a distant third on the Q1 poll, though still a good ways ahead of all the other games on the list. This is a game that I do have some mixed feelings about. Larian still seems to be trying to find a good balance for both the game's tone as well as their interpretation of the D&D 5e rule set. Generally speaking, I enjoy the game. I had a lot of fun playing it when it first hit early access, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the full launch has to offer. I've off and on debated returning for another look at the latest early access builds, but I think the big thing that's held me back is that weirdly low level cap. Don't get me wrong, I understand restricting content in an early access build, so as not to spoil all the content before a game hits full launch. But at the same time, it feels like Larian is really kind of approaching early access a little backwards. They keep adding more and more story content for us to explore, i.e. the stuff that is actually full of spoilers, while drip-feeding us little bits and pieces of the game's actual core mechanics. The basic character build options, including pretty much everything beyond level 4. I want to be optimistic about this one. The game looks gorgeous, and I do anticipate having fun with it. I'm just a little skeptical that it's all going to balance out at launch, both tonally and gameplay-wise. That said, the next big patch is supposed to finally boost the level cap to 5, out of like 12 or 15, something like that. So, maybe it is finally time to peek back in and see how things are coming along. Maybe that'll allay some of my nagging concerns. Of course, given that it would still be in early access, it would also have to be a fairly short series. Likely, 10 episodes, something in that area. We'd probably just create a new character using one of the more recent added races and/or class options, and then run them up to level 5. But I would be hesitant to push it any further than that. Especially given that the latest word is full launch is supposed to drop before the end of the year. After that, we've got Shadowrun Dragonfall, which, shockingly, tied for 4th in the Q1 poll, alongside Wildermyth, which we'll talk about in a moment. Shadowrun Dragonfall is a game I am very much looking forward to playing at some point. I mean, I've played it before. I backed all of the Harebrained Schemes Kickstarters, but aside from Battletech, I've never actually made any videos on them. While I would like to eventually do all 3 of the HBS Shadowrun games, I do think that Dragonfall is the best of the bunch. In my opinion, it hits the best balance of gameplay and narrative, telling a compelling story, while still giving the player a fair amount of, gameplay content to actually explore. Shadowrun Returns is a lot more primitive in comparison, both from a gameplay and a narrative standpoint, while Shadowrun Hong Kong has a fantastic story, and some very interesting companions, except for maybe Duncan, but it suffers from an excessively loquacious narrative. And mind you, this is coming from me, the guy who loves to read all the things. Some of the games I play are literally nothing but text. Well, text and pictures, but you get the idea. Hong Kong just gets to the point where it's something like 80% dialogue and 20% actual shadow running. That's a little excessive, even by my standards. Regardless, just focusing on Dragonfall for now, I feel like that would make for a pretty fun mid-length series. It's been a while since the last time I actually played it, but I guess it'd run for about 25, maybe 30 episodes long. I feel like that's a pretty reasonable investment, despite it being a slightly older game. Now, as for Wildermyth, I don't think I made it much of a secret that I love playing that game, and I will always be happy to have an excuse to play more of it. Especially since the developers keep adding new bits and bobs every time I look the other way, and that's just the free content updates. They've still got some sort of super secret paid expansion in the works, and who knows what that'll add. I will say, sadly, Wildermyth doesn't exactly bring in big numbers on the channel. It's one of those series that I'm mostly just doing for myself and a small subset of the raiders and rank-and-file viewers. I think it's just one of those games where the art style really ends up holding it back. And to a lesser extent, I'm also just kind of too good at it, so I make it look almost boringly easy at times. That is thankfully not a problem I have with most other games. But I wish it got more traction, but at the same time, I like it enough that I won't let those low numbers stop me from revisiting it. There's just something about it. I love the way it lets you insert your own customized characters, in this case, the raiders and rank-and-file viewers, and then you watch them evolve and grow throughout their adventures. It's the same reason I ended up playing so much Battle Brothers back in the day, and to a lesser extent, games like Darkest Dungeon, Phoenix Point, even XCOM 2, though in those cases, character evolution did tend to be a lot more limited and linear. It also helps that Wildermyth is basically pre-packaged into bite-sized campaigns, so we're rarely looking at more than a 10 or 15 episode commitment. I'm not exactly sure when we'll be jumping back into this one, but I do know the next campaign we'll be running is Monarchs Under the Mountain. That is a 5-chapter campaign that'll run us about 12 to 15 episodes, so slightly on the longer side. And I believe it's also the first one that really starts ramping up the difficulty, though the hardest campaigns are yet to come. I'll admit, I'm actually kind of dreading some of the campaigns after that, Aluna and the Moth in particular, because those can end up spiraling out of control pretty quickly. Difficulty in Wildermyth often dances along the razor's edge, Things are either going great, or they are going absolutely awful. It's got one of those game balances where things kind of start cascading in the direction you're already headed, so there's rarely much of an in-between. Still, very much looking forward to tackling all of the campaigns eventually, including any new ones they release in future updates or DLC. You know, apologies in advance to those of you who just aren't into it. I get it. It's just a game that really appeals to my very particular interests. Look, I spent decades running tabletop campaigns, watching dozens, maybe even hundreds of adventurers give life and limb to leave their mark on various campaign worlds. As a result, I find games with those sorts of procedural character legacy systems to be uniquely fascinating, and Wildermyth is probably one of the best ones I've seen thus far. Moving on, we've got Phoenix Point, the game that, in many ways, started this channel. I mean, granted, the channel was originally going to be something completely different than what it is now, but Phoenix Point was one of the first things I actually ended up making a video about. At least a video that I actually uploaded and unleashed upon the public. You're never going to see the ones that I didn't upload. As such, Phoenix Point will always have a special place in my heart. Even if it didn't turn out quite the way I think a lot of us were hoping it would. It's a decent game that could have been great, I think, if they had just stuck with Julian Gollop's original vision, instead of essentially sanitizing and simplifying it to draw in more of the Firaxis XCOM crowd. Then again, I can't really be sore about it, because I also understand that if they had stuck with those original visions, they basically would have been dooming themselves to create a great but very niche title. It's a game with a fascinating foundation that was compromised by compromises. And the end result wasn't terrible. I mean, I still had a lot of fun talking about it pre-launch, and I think the launch build's pretty solid. The DLCs, those have been a bit shakier. Some of them just get way too grindy and repetitive for my liking. You know, to the point where I feel like they actively detract from the game. But there are some decent concepts in there. There's some fun mechanics, even if it doesn't quite match up with the incredible narrative that Alan Stroud and Jonas Kairatses originally created. That said, I would still absolutely love to revisit the game for at least one more playthrough. I'd be hesitant if we were just looking at using the vanilla DLC, but there's actually a really ambitious rebalance patch called Terror from the Void that overhauls the entire campaign, DLC included. It provides more tactical options, both on and off the battlefield, ramps up the challenge with smarter and stronger enemies, and perhaps most notably, it tries to better integrate the DLCs into the main campaign, from both a gameplay and narrative perspective. Heck, it even re-implements the ODI meter, a fairly prominent gameplay mechanic that was inexplicably stripped out of the core game sometime after I recorded my original launch series. That alone was enough to get my attention, because I always thought the ODI system added a really nice eldritch flair to the overarching campaign. And of course, it was also a major part of the original narrative that Stroud and Kairatses had created. That aside, playing a game like Phoenix Point also gives me a great excuse to start drafting raiders and rank-and-file viewers to use as cannon fodder. That used to be something I did all the time back in the day, with games like Battle Bros, Darkest Dungeon, XCOM 2, and, of course, Phoenix Point. But these days, I barely feel like I do it at all, outside of the occasional Wildermyth campaign. And, you know, maybe stuff like Solasta and Through the Ashes. But that's not really the same. Whipping up 3 or 4 custom adventurers is a far cry different from hosting an entire roster of 30-plus disposable heroes. I wouldn't exactly say it's a priority project, but Phoenix Point is definitely something I still think about. I figure it would make for a pretty decent mid-length series. The original ran for about 39 episodes, so I figure with the DLC lumped in, we'd probably be looking at about 50. Again, definitely not a priority, but still something I'd love to do if there's ever enough time or interest to actually justify doing it. After that, we've got Hard West 2, which is an interesting one. I mean, obviously we've kind of missed the best time to do it, which was right after the full game came out. But it is still a game I enjoyed enough that I wouldn't mind giving it a full series. While I do feel like it's a pretty generic and by-the-numbers tactical title, it's competently made and visually appealing, which is a growing rarity when it comes to games in my particular niche. I do wish that it had a bit of a harder edge and a little more granularity like the original game did. But again, much like with Phoenix Point, I understand why the new dev team decided to sort of sanitize the whole thing into a more generic package. I think if it was a longer game, I'd have less interest in actually running through it. But from what I understand, it's only about 20 hours long. That's a pretty solid mid-length series, roughly 10 weeks worth of cinematic supernatural Western content. But not so much that it overstays its welcome. I'm also just a big fan of those sorts of anachronistic genre mashups. Frontier Western mashups in particular. I ran multiple Deadlands campaigns over the year, which is the tabletop RPG that heavily inspired the original Hard West setting. Heck, I also ran Hell on Earth for a while, and even a little Werewolf Wild West for the like 20 minutes that White Wolf was still supporting it. I am always down for a quick detour into the Weird West. But as with a lot of the lower priority projects, it does ultimately come down to whether or not we have enough time or viewer interest to justify doing it. Which, honestly, is kind of a common refrain for a lot of the other projects on the Q1 poll. Stuff like Encased, Expeditions Rome, King Arthur, those are all good examples of that. Those are games that I would love to do some videos on. They've just never gained enough traction on the polls to really justify the time it would take to get us into them. I suppose the other issues in those cases, though, is that all three of those games are definitely on the longer side. Encased is the shortest, with an estimated runtime of maybe about 40 hours, but Rome and King Arthur run 50 to 60 easy. Doing an entire run through those games would be a pretty hefty time investment. We're talking 6 months minimum, which is risky when it comes to a title that also hasn't really shown it has long-term sustainability. As aforementioned, I have no real qualms about running games like Wrath or Kingmaker all the way to the end, because they have proven that they have enough of a built-in audience to justify running them indefinitely. I can't say the same when it comes to untested games like these other three, especially when it comes to something like Encased, which I like, but which also has a lot of low-budget indie jank when you start getting towards the midpoint. In cases like these, while I do absolutely love the idea of dipping into them, I think it would be on a strictly segmented or self-contained basis. We'd essentially commit to running through a predefined chunk of the game. The prologue, the first chapter, the first major area. Basically, whatever would give us about 6 to 12 episodes worth of content, and would leave off at a relatively satisfying point in the story. Albeit, obviously a cliffhanger. The main goal would be to get some gameplay videos out there in front of the viewers, so they can see what the game is like, and give them time to decide whether they want to see more. If they do, great, that's all the justification we need to run through another chunk of campaign. Maybe even all the way to the end if the numbers continue to justify it. And if not, then that's fine too. At the very least, it'll have gotten the game out in front of more people. And maybe some of those people will end up liking it enough to go check it out for themselves. The early intent of this channel was to talk up interesting new RPGs and turn-based tactical games, crowdfunded or otherwise. While I do still like the idea of doing full runs when the numbers justify it, I'd still be satisfied just dipping a toe into some of these titles. I've been meaning to get back to doing more one-shots and short runs for a while now, and this might be an ideal way to do just that. Now, on a slightly tangential note, we've got a weird one that I decided not to lump in with those other three. Pentiment, which clocked in at number 8 on the Q1 poll. I'll admit, given that it's an Obsidian game, I really kind of expected it to gain a little more traction, especially in its release month. But at the same time, I also completely understand why it didn't. It's a weird game, as most Obsidian games tend to be. That said, I actually do want to at least touch on this one, enough so that I might end up working on a short-run series in my spare time, assuming I ever have spare time, that is. That's kind of up in the air these days, what with the never-ending probate and all. But, full disclosure, I did play through the entire campaign right after it came out, in my own time, not as a series, obviously. And while I can't say I loved it, I did find it fascinating. It's a very intriguing story wrapped up in a fun and quirky art style, and way too many pointless little minigames. But, I really do think it's at least worth a look. Maybe not a full playthrough, but I would love to at least run us through the first main chapter. Of course, since I've already run through the game once on my own, I'd also make sure to pick out different character traits and investigate different clues in any episodes I might record. That way I'd still be seeing and reacting to some entirely new content alongside the rest of you. However, I'll also admit this is one of those games where I actually don't think it would perform very well on YouTube. It's a very slow-boil, text-heavy mystery game with a lot of lore. Aside from the occasional murder, there's not really anything flashy to hold your average viewer's interest. I don't even think we'd get to that first murder until like 3 episodes in. I imagine it would start strong, as the first couple of episodes piqued viewer curiosity, but would then drop off sharply as we got deeper into the series, and only the really invested viewers continued watching it. Again, I at least want to try doing something with it. I think it's a fascinating enough story and a fascinating enough game to deserve at least 2 or 3 videos. And who knows, maybe it'll end up surprising me and somehow gain enough traction to justify pushing all the way through to the end. As with many other potential projects on this list, there's no real way of knowing until I at least give it a try. Moving further down the list, we've got a much more conventional title, Xenonauts 2, which is supposedly, finally, hitting its early access launch after months and years of perpetual delays. The first game was a pretty solid, if generic, homage to classic XCOM, modernized in some ways, but more limited in others. And in comparison, Xenonauts 2 is being touted as an expanded and improved remake of that first game. And in following the dev blogs, I will agree. What they've showcased definitely makes it look like a very solid upgrade over Xenonauts 1. I've been jonesing for another solid XCOM-like for a while now, and aside from Phoenix Point, we just really haven't seen any over the past few years. I mean, sure, we've had games like XCOM Chimera Squad or Gears Tactics, but they were much more limited in scope, with a heavier focus on cinematic and narrative storytelling versus the classic XCOM formula. Much like with Phoenix Point, I really just want an excuse to draft some viewers and throw them into battle against a vastly superior, unstoppable force. Given that Xenonauts is also a game that's pretty light on narrative, as opposed to Phoenix Point, which throws a narrative event at you every fight or two, it might even be a good excuse to make up some narrative of my own. I haven't really done a narrative series since way back, like 4 or 5 years at least, with games like Darkest Dungeon and XCOM 2. I never really thought I was good at it, that's kind of why I stopped doing it, but I did have fun experimenting with it, and a lot of my early viewers really did seem to enjoy it too. There were some folks who were really, really invested in that stuff. A game like Xenonauts 2 might be a good excuse to give that another shot, even if we keep it relatively simple. The occasional narrative story insert or after-action report, for example, just to get us a little more invested in the fates of our otherwise faceless and expendable soldiers. You know, the viewers unfortunate enough to be drafted into a one-sided war against infinite alien invaders. I don't know if I'd be able to sustain something like that, but I certainly wouldn't be adverse to trying. Either way, Xenonauts 2 is a game I want to touch on regardless, so even if we just end up playing it for a couple of episodes, I still think it could be a lot of fun. Though, of course, that's also contingent on it actually coming out, which is a whole other can of worms. I'm sure they'll get there, eventually. Honestly, I've got similar feelings about a couple of other titles further down the list. The venerable Battle Brothers and relative newcomer Cyberknight's Flashpoint. Those are games that both land in very different narrative genres, but which are otherwise very similar to the gameplay loop you'd see in something like Phoenix Point or XCOM or Xenonauts 2. But with the added bonus that you've also got a slightly more robust character evolution system in place. While it's obviously not as ambitious as the mechanics in a game like Wildermyth, there's a lot to be said for the injury and narrative event system in Battle Brothers. We had a lot of fun with that back in the day. I mean, heck, we ran a solid 100 plus episodes or so before I decided it was finally time to move on. Granted, at this point, Battle Brothers is an older game that really has a hard time competing with hotter, newer titles when it comes to our limited production time. But it's still a game I think about going back to every once in a while. I'm not particularly good at it, but I do enjoy playing it. And as always, I enjoy the idea of running any series where I get to throw a bunch of raiders in front of certain death and just kind of hope for the best. I think if we were to return to the game at this point, it'd probably be with the sort of segmented approach I mentioned earlier, only instead of running it for just one chapter, it'd be up until the first Crisis event. I'd also do some more aggressive editing to trim out a lot of the filler material, travel time, bookkeeping. So I figured it'd make for about a 20, maybe 25 episode commitment from start to finish. Just enough time to establish a new warband, have some fun trying to keep everyone alive, and hopefully surviving our first Crisis event. And then, much like with the other Perspective projects, it'd be up to the viewers as to whether or not we kept on going with it. It'd be a simple enough matter to continue an already ongoing campaign, or to start a new one with a new origin, since those Crisis events do give us a natural breaking point between each potential mini. Cyberknight's Flashpoint would theoretically follow a somewhat similar pattern, though in that case it's hard to really talk specifics since it's obviously a game that hasn't actually come out just yet. At the moment, we're just coming up on the early access launch, so anything we ended up doing with it now would be inherently short-run and self-contained. Long-term, Cyberknights is the sort of game that, conceptually, I might like the idea of doing a full run-through, but it's really going to depend on exactly what it's like when it finally hits full launch. My biggest concern with these sorts of games is always just how grindy they might be. But I've got to say, I do absolutely love the idea of running a hardcore cyberpunk squad through a semi-narrative turn-based tactical campaign. Even more so if we get to slot a bunch of the raiders in there. But of course, again, I have to see if I actually end up enjoying it before I can make any sort of real commitment. At the moment, it's a game that does look pretty promising. Despite the usual expected dose of low-budget indie jank, that can't really be avoided. I'm hoping for the best, and I'm really looking forward to at least giving it a shot. I mean, the game's got a character class that comes with cybernetic murder cats. How could I possibly pass that up? After that, we're starting to get into the latter half of the list, which isn't to say that these are bad projects, just that they're the ones that have a lower perceived demand among the viewers. And right on the cusp of that precipice, we've got Slay the Princess, the new standalone narrative game coming from Black Tabby, the folks behind my beloved Scarlet Hollow. I will say, I'm not really a huge fan of visual novels, but I make a huge exception when it comes to Black Tabby games. Scarlet Hollow really blew me away, and I also really enjoyed the demo for Slay the Princess. It has the same quirky sense of humor and horror that we've seen from Scarlet Hollow, but with the added benefit of full voice acting and a really, really mind-bending metaplot that I find very intriguing. I suppose the main downside when it comes to Slay the Princess is that it is just a standalone one-shot as opposed to Scarlet Hollow's 6-part episodic release. We won't have the same sort of attachment to characters like the narrator and the princess, because we'll only end up knowing them for like 5 or 6 hours overall, and even that'll be broken up into smaller narrative chunks, as opposed to raider favorites like Tabby or Stella, who we've already spent 15 plus hours getting to know. Inversely, though, it does also mean we won't be stuck waiting half a year between each new chapter. Once it's out, Slay the Princess will be a completely self-contained one-shot, narrative adventure. It has the makings of a great short or mid-run series, maybe even multiple short runs depending on its replayability. The demo certainly made it look like the game will give you plenty of excuses to go back and run through it again, so who knows? Maybe we'll end up doing multiple short runs, each one exploring one of the increasingly unhinged and horrifying narrative paths as we try to build a more cohesive picture of the overarching story. I mean, look, normally I wouldn't say that. I do tend to take a very cautious approach to any potential new project, but Black Teddy Games has done a lot to earn my trust when it comes to these sorts of games. So I think it's pretty safe to say that we'll be spending at least some time on it. And, as for Scarlet Hollow, not a lot to say there. It's sadly not one of my better performing series. In fact, it's probably one of the worst. But it's also a game that I love so much like Wildermyth, that I will continue doing it anyway. It's basically a series I'm doing for myself and for a small subset of the raiders, the fine folks who help make those sorts of videos possible. I can't afford to do too many series like that. It's just not financially sustainable, but I am willing to make the occasional exception when it comes to a game that I really enjoy, like Scarlet Hollow. Beyond that, we're starting to get into the stuff that definitely has less enthusiasm from the rank-and-file viewers. That includes stuff like Stygian, a series which I do want to finish someday, but which I also fully understand the lack of interest in. That is one of those weird games that has a really great concept, but a very unfortunate execution. Sadly, it's one of those early indie Kickstarter games that just didn't raise enough money to really realize the full scope of their original vision. Much like with Encased, or even Wasteland 3, it's a game that's just full of placeholders and unfinished content, to the point where it's hard to play it without constantly seeing signs of what could have been, versus what it actually ended up being. It's sad, but at the same time, what's there is still pretty solid, and I mean, let's be honest, there just aren't a lot of Lovecraftian CRPGs out there. I love the concept of a turn-based tactical Lovecraft game, and we just don't have a lot of those to choose from. Stygian tried to be one of the first. They just went too big and too bold without the budget to actually see it through. I respect what they tried to do, and I do want to finish exploring what they accomplished someday. It's just, understandably, a lower priority project. Though, while we're on the concept of Lovecraftian adventure games, I'll also note that Dreams of the Witch House is supposed to be coming out sometime very soon. That's not quite the same eldritch horror as Stygian. They're both Lovecraftian survival games, but they diverge pretty heavily after that. Stygian is definitely more of a conventional isometric CRPG, but in comparison, Dreams in the Witch House is more of a hybrid point-and-click adventure game. We ran through the demo not too far back, and while it was a little awkwardly paced and a little grindy, I actually found it to be a very unique and fascinating experience. As with Pentiment, my gut instinct is that it's not the sort of game that would make a particularly successful series, but it's also a game I find interesting enough that I want to at least do something with it, even if it's just one or two more videos. Would it be worth doing a full series on? Probably not. But hey, that's the sort of thing I can't say for certain until we at least give it a shot. On a related note, I have actually earmarked a bunch of other point-and-click adventure games over the past few years. Nightmare Frames was another one that recently caught my eye, and I guess technically Cats and the Other Lives probably fits into this category as well. I've never ended up pursuing them because I always got the impression that it's not quite what my audience is looking for. That said, as we get later into the year and I hopefully start finding myself with more time to work on random side projects, I might start pushing them a little more often, at least for the occasional one-shot or short run. I love CRPGs and turn-based tactical games, but at the end of the day, the main thing that will always catch my attention is an engaging or entertaining narrative, especially when it's attached to an unusual setting. Games like Pentiment, Stygian, and Dreams in the Witch House all fall into that category. Hence, they're all projects I'd love to pursue at some point in the future, even if just for a short while. You know, and I feel like I'm a broken record here, but it's really just a matter of finding time for those sorts of lower priority projects between the higher profile ones. I'm obviously not going to displace something like Wrath or Rogue Trader for a smaller experimental series. But it's definitely the sort of thing I might try to squeeze in as a quick little bonus project when I'm between those bigger projects. Or just when I need a break or a change of pace or a palate cleanser. You know, basically the same thing I use Wildermyth for. A little further down the list, we've got Colony Ship, a hardcore sci-fi CRPG from the creators of Age of Decadence. And that one fluctuates wildly on the polls from one month to the next. Some months it gets as high as the top 5, other months it's all the way down in the bottom 5. Viewer interest is a fickle beast. I've talked a little bit about this one in the past. It's a game I do want to touch on at some point because I actually think it's pretty fantastic. The main problem is that the full launch is slated for later this year, I believe summer. So if we do end up dipping into the early access build, it would have to be a pretty brief dip. I'll also say, I actually do think this is a solid enough CRPG that it might be worth doing a full run on once the whole thing is available. That just becomes harder and harder to justify if we end up spending any significant amount of time on it in the pre-launch phase. A game like Wrath or Rogue Trader is big enough and has enough hype, I think, to justify essentially retreading entire chapters between the early access and launch builds. But, I'm just not sure a smaller indie title like Colony Ship would carry that same sort of AA clout. That said, the full launch is tentatively slated for like 5-6 months out, so even if I don't end up doing anything with the early access builds, that is a game that I will definitely be hitting on launch. After that, we've got the Darkest Dungeon twins, Darkest Dungeon and Darkest Dungeon 2. I'm not really sure what to say about those two. Both games have some passionate fans, but by and large, the bulk of my audience really seems to have moved past them. I do like the idea of finishing the old narrative series I was doing for Darkest Dungeon, but let's be honest, that'd require something like another 100 episodes, at least. The game just gets really grindy and repetitive in the mid and late game phases, and it doesn't help that I made the mistake of enabling Crimson Court. I didn't know any better at the time, and that bogs down the entire series with even more grindy and repetitive content. Darkest Dungeon 2, on the other hand, is an almost completely different animal. Despite having some thematic similarities to the original game, they basically turned it into a completely different campaign and narrative experience, one which I can't say I find as appealing. The Hamlet was literally and figuratively the foundation for the entire first campaign. Heroes would come and go, as would enemies, but the Hamlet was one of the few constants that was just always there. It's a big part of what the player would build their own personal headcanons around, much as I did with my rambling narrative about a well-meaning but largely inept aristocrat trying to nurse it back from the brink. In the sequel, however, there is no Hamlet. Heck, there aren't even persistent heroes. The whole thing is broken down into a series of largely standalone caravan runs, each one so segmented from the others that it might as well be its own new mini-campaign. I mean, sure, there are some things that carry over from one caravan run to the next, but I just don't think it hits the same sort of tension that comes from more consistent continuity. In Darkest Dungeon, a crawl gone awry would leave you desperately hoping that your hard-won heroes would at least survive long enough to make it back to the Hamlet, back home, where they could spend some time recuperating before their next inevitable death-defying adventure. And hey, maybe you'd even make it out with enough hard-won treasure to make an upgrade or two as recompense for all their pain and suffering. A small silver lining on the dark cloud that was ultimately failure on that particular dungeon run. I just don't feel like you get that with Darkest Dungeon 2, because your heroes are inherently disposable, more so than they were in the first game. If you lose, your heroes are gone forever. There's no retreating back to the safety of your home base or trying to nurse the survivors back to health. They're just gone. I really feel like that ends up working against the themes of persistence in the face of impossible odds that the original game really sort of fostered. And finally, I guess that brings us to Fallout Van Buren, right down towards the bottom of the list. Again, this is a project I do want to finish someday, but I'll admit it's a passion project, but it's also one I just haven't really felt all that inspired to work on as of late. I mean, I suppose a big part of that is just that with everything that's been going on in my life this past year or so, I just haven't really been in the right headspace for those sorts of research-intensive passion projects. It also doesn't help that the Fallout franchise has really kind of started to stagnate as of late. The only thing you ever hear about it anymore are the random recycled updates they keep jamming into Fallout 76. And I've got to say, that really just doesn't do it for me. As of this point, I believe we only really have one major installment left, a 1 or 2-part episode about Bomb Station 1 and the ending of the game. I was also debating doing an episode about New Canaan, though I'll admit that's not a location I ever found all that interesting, so I think that was one that I was just as likely to end up skipping, especially since, like Circle Junction, it was one of those locations that was earmarked very early in development to basically be cut wholesale from the game. Fort Abandon, though, that one was also on my to-do list, but that's an odd one because we have very little in the way of reliable information on what it was supposed to include. Much like the Tibbetts facility, it's one of the more mysterious locations that we might just never really end up learning about, short of Josh Sawyer or Chris Avallone suddenly deciding to release their original notes. On a somewhat similar note, though, I will say that I've also always kind of wanted to talk about some of the other canceled Fallout games, like Fallout Extreme or Fallout Tactics 2, maybe even Brotherhood of Steel 2, but that would definitely be lower on my list. The main problem being that all of those games were canceled so early in development that there's just not really a whole lot to talk about. Then again, that might actually work to their advantage. The most daunting thing about making these Van Buren videos is that there are just so many fragmented notes and interviews and images I have to analyze and stitch together to create a more cohesive whole that it becomes overwhelming. When it comes to something like Fallout Extreme, though, for example, we've really only got like 2 pages of info and a handful of rough concept art. I suppose that would make for a fairly short video, but one that might still be fun to talk about. Maybe I'll poke at them a little over the next few months and see what I can come up with. Who knows, maybe it'll even rekindle my passion for some of those other related projects. Like I said, I really would like to wrap up the Van Buren series someday. After that, we really just get into the dregs of my potential projects, oddball little indie games like Space Wreck or Road Warden. Those are games that I don't think will ever gain enough traction on the polls to justify doing full runs, but which I might still try to do random one-shots for, as time and energy allows. One of the really interesting games, though, that I would lump onto that list is House of Many Doors, a game I may have talked about once or twice before. It's a really, really low-budget spin-off of the Sunless Seas series. Essentially a narrative exploration and survival game set in a surreal purgatory populated by damned souls who trade in memories and travel around the monster-infested wastes in massive spider-legged trains. I think what I find really fascinating about it is that, despite initially coming across as pure weapons-grade nonsense, like the Sunless games do, House of Many Doors has a setting that starts off as ridiculous nonsense, but then starts to slowly come together the further you get into it. The more you play it, the more the narrative threads start tying together, and the more you find out about why everything is so strange and unhinged. And you meet a lot of fascinating characters in the process, not to mention you can engage in some very, Some very inadvisable romantic scenarios. Don't get me wrong there, nothing unsavory, nothing illegal, more like the sort of romantic scenarios where you can't help but wonder, why? I don't want to drop too many spoilers here, because this is a game I might end up exploring with y'all at some point, but I will say this. If you have ever been sexually attracted to an oil rig, or 100 crows, then this might just be the game for you. It's not quite my thing, but I will say that it makes for some very, very memorable experiences, and that's really House of Many Doors in a nutshell. It is an abstract and often completely insane world with an underlying web of carefully crafted narrative threads. I've actually had it on my potential project list since I first started the channel, but I've always held off on doing anything with it because the game is not pretty to look at. It's got the occasional splash art and a truly fantastic setting and story and atmosphere, but otherwise the visuals and the gameplay elements are mediocre at best. They hold back the rest of the package. I'd really love to do something with it someday, because I do think it's something that's worth sharing. Unfortunately, it is also one of those series where I fully expect that it would fail to gain any meaningful traction and would just end up dragging down the channel analytics for a month or two. If I start doing random one-shots and short runs again, I might include that one on the list. I'd love to share it, even if just briefly. Oh, and it is also worth mentioning that it is another one of those games where I can insert the names of random raiders. In this case, as the hapless and expendable crew on my soul-powered spider train. All manner of horrific fates await those brave enough to explore what the House of Many Doors has to offer. Having played it before, I can pretty much guarantee that it would quite possibly have the highest casualty rating of any series I've run in the past. And that really kind of makes me want to do it even more. Anyway, I could go on. There's actually dozens of other games on my list of prospective projects, but I think that touches on most of the really big ones. There's a lot of games I'd actually love to talk about, but a bunch of them are either so far from launch that it's just not worth talking about them yet, or they're so limited in scope that I can't really see doing more than a one-shot or short run, and if I'm going to do that, then I'm just going to do it. Regardless, I have been rambling nonsense for the past hour or so, and my throat is starting to disintegrate. So we should really probably put a pin in this thing. Plus, I do have more projects in the queue. Currently working on Wrath 101 and Rogue Trader Alpha 19. So that said, let's go ahead and start winding this thing down so I can pack this thing up, slap a bow on it, and roll it out to the 100 or so viewers who will actually bother listening to it. As always, I'd like to do that by thanking you, the viewer, for sticking around and supporting the channel. I know it might not feel like much, but commenting, liking, subscribing, those all contribute towards helping the channel grow. Heck, even just watching the videos helps keep this whole shindig a little more sustainable. At the end of the day, those are the numbers that YouTube uses to measure just how hard it should be pushing my videos onto new potential viewers. The higher those numbers get, the more aggressively YouTube pushes my channel, which has a direct impact on the channel's growth and sustainability. Now, I don't know if we'll ever actually get to that coveted 100,000 subscriber mark. It'd be nice, but at the current rate of growth, it would take roughly 113 years. But despite that, we do still see slow but steady growth from one month to the next. We've never had a month where we've actively lost growth. Given that I'm very much the definition of an amateur content creator, I'd say that's not too shabby. And hey, there's no telling what the future might bring. And then, aside from that, of course, I'd like to also give special thanks to the raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible. While the rank-and-file viewers certainly help in their own way, the raiders are the generous souls that contribute a little more directly to the financial sustainability of this whole operation. Their donations help cover overhead, including the cost of games, editing software, utility bills, and feeding my clowder of cute and carnivorous murder cats. On top of that, as aforementioned, they're also the folks that make it more feasible for me to work on my occasional passion project, like Wildermyth or Scarlet Hollow. Without them, I'd have a much harder time justifying those sorts of low-view projects. So in this case, they're literally the fine folks who make those videos possible. That said, I'd like to give special thanks to the honorary raiders from October to January. Adam Coles, Alexander Hochbaum, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, Bose77, C1S, Cage, Christian, Chronosaur, David Pascal, Dupin, Ego2, Ethan Vonderweed, Felix Christoph, Flamebeard, Gareth Bryant, ICU Uwu, Idabaw, James Bullock, Lulalu, Matt Harris, Misha, Oil of Hope, Optimal 2, Peter, Porphy's Attorney, Rob H., Roman Berger, Sam Russell, Served Cold, Sean Smith, Steve Saxa, and Tote Alborg. I'd also like to give extra special thanks to the veteran raiders from the past few months. Blaine Landowski, Bob, Dale Johnson, Dr. Funkenstein, Glenn Jensen, Gresham, Ice Storm Shadow, Indiana Smith, Jacob Kalabinski, Jay Sorkblood, Jeffrey McInnes, Jeremy Worth, Kami Shahi, Caspis, Killer Minnow, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Max Robespierre, Michael Bain, Nerd Prof, Neurolancer, Nishko, Nod Goblin Nico, Raximus Savage, Scott Brown, Sensei Yums, Sean Orpin, Sandre Martin Jensen, Stoltz, Terry Williams, The Link King, The Book Thief, Thomas K. Arata, Valenrook, Varshoon, Vertigo 322, Zarmal, and Zlywakla. Zlywakla? Yeah, that's probably right. And, of course, honorary mention to the ever-expanding ranks of the Raider Elite. Folks like Dragon Matrix 7, Matthew Smith, and Revenant. And possibly Eloise, Drakith, Egg, Erie V23, Egon Alter, Emil, Excelsior, Gottlieb, James Tremier, Kazorm, Mark Giemza, Nathan Welch Jr., Overlord Ferrum, Random Passerby, Robbie B., Thomas Pietkowski, Trip Hoppenskip, and Valenrook. I mean, it really depends on how picky you're being and what your exact definition of elite might be, but sure, I'll give those guys the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we are raiders after all. Exacting terminology has never really been our strong point. So, thanks, guys. I appreciate you too. My throat is actually starting to hurt, so we really do need to wrap this up. But before we do, if you would also like to help support the channel, and in doing so, join the ranks of the illustrious Retcon Raiders, then feel free to check out the links below to our Patreon, our YouTube memberships, our PayPal. Anything's appreciated. It all helps, especially these days, given recent unexpected expenses stemming from events of last year. Again, we'll not get too deep into that. I feel like I already complain about it enough. And while I don't have a lot to offer in return, aside from continuing to make videos, obviously, rank doth have its privileges, depending on the tier that you decide to back at. Membership in the Raiders comes with varying tiers of shoutouts, like the ones we just had in this video. Access to my increasingly rambling blog posts, slightly more cat pictures than normal, and even early access to some or all of my videos. It also makes you slightly more likely to be drafted into those various doomsday scenarios I outlined earlier. Battle Brothers, Xenonauts 2, Cyber Knights Flashpoint, House of Many Doors, where you can enjoy seeing your digital avatar struggle against impossible odds before inevitably being ripped limb from limb. So, there's that too. Lucky you. But hey, if you don't find that appealing, and trust me, that is perfectly understandable, or if you just can't or don't want to donate financially to the channel, that's perfectly fine too. As I stressed earlier, even the rank and file viewers help keep this channel going. Just engaging with one of my videos, watching it, liking, clicking, subscribing, it all helps, and it all adds up. No matter what you decide you're comfortable with, I am thankful for it all. I'm honestly just amazed that people continue watching and enjoying these videos in the first place. Especially ones like this, where I just basically ramble until my brain starts melting. But hey, here you are. So, thanks for that too. That said, this is Retcon Raider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, if you need to get in touch with me for any reason, you can do so in the comments section on any of my videos or community posts. Or you can contact me over on Discord, Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, or through my official email address. As always, links are in the description.